This is an excerpt from To the Chief Singer by Axchie A. Bolitho. Chapter 1. Barney is the Lord's. Section, A Neighborhood Revival. Thus in work and play the years passed until Barney was in his 16th year. It was about this time that J.C. Fisher and a company of workers came into the community near Bangor, Michigan, where Barney was working for a farm family by the name of Abbott. This family experienced a revival in their religious life during the meetings, and the whole community was greatly stirred. Almost daily prayer meetings were held, many were converted, and a spirit of concern for the salvation of others took hold of many hearts. This concern did not pass away with the closing of the special meetings, but continued to increase in the neighborhood. Young Barney fell under conviction. He did not understand clearly the reason why he could neither eat nor sleep in peace, nor could he fathom that gnawing dissatisfaction within. Having heard the use of tobacco condemned, he thought perhaps that was what was bothering him. So on the way home from town one day, standing up in a wagon in a pouring rain, he stopped the team at a place where a hedge fence and a big gate made a convenient corner. There he spit out the offending cud, and drawing the 3 plugs he had just bought out of his pocket, he threw them into the grass just between the fence and the gate post, being very careful to note exactly where they fell. For a week he was in worse misery than before. The hunger for tobacco gave him no rest. He could neither beg, borrow, nor buy any. Having to go to town the next weekend, he stopped at the gate, found his tobacco in the grass, and when he had taken a good chew, felt greatly relieved. But the torment of his conscience soon seemed worse than the craving for tobacco. So he began to turn over in his mind plans for stopping gradually. Perhaps if he took just a little chew, now and then, he could break himself of the habit. Then he recalled the experience of an elderly man, who, when asked if he had quit the tobacco habit, replied, "I'm tapering off." Meeting him later, Barney had asked him how he was succeeding, and heard the bad news that the taper end had come to be the biggest end. Well, since I'm chewing anyway, thought Barney, I may as well chew big cuds as small ones. Thus the struggle went on for about 10 days of misery. Then he was invited to attend a prayer meeting in the Abbott home. Those prayer meetings were dead in earnest. People came there to find God, and they were given a chance to do so. A young man in that first meeting asked Barney to go to the altar with him, but Barney was not ready and said so. "If you want to go, don't wait for me. I'm not fully decided yet. I want to count the cost." And count the cost he did. Each time he tried to pray, the tobacco which so dominated him rose up before him. Could he give it up? Did he want to? Yes, he hated being a slave to a weed. It was about the only idol the boy had, the only thing that stood between him and God. But it was enough to shut out the face of God and the peace for which he longed. Finally, he could endure it no longer. Like Bunyan's pilgrim, the burden upon his conscience took all the joy out of living. The misery of knowing himself a slave, the hunger for the knowledge of God's forgiving grace, and the sight of men and women all around him rejoicing in the love of God, all this was too much for him. He must find the little wicket gate or die. It took no urging to bring him to the next prayer meeting. He had made his decision. He would give up tobacco and anything else God asked him to give up, and he would never touch it again even if he died from want of it. Already peace had begun its healing work. He went to the prayer meeting, his flying feet scarce able to keep pace with the eager pursuit of his soul. He expected to meet Christ there. He could hardly wait for the invitation. Had he known it, he might have taken Christ at his word the moment his decision was made, but he did not know. He thought the altar where God's people prayed was the only place in which to find the pearl of great price. Thus he came, surrendered, expectant, and he was not disappointed. Bowing there in that farmhouse, consecrated by the godly lives of Father Abbott and his family, and by the tears and prayers of those who gathered there to plead for the lost, Barney found Christ waiting for him. For the first time in his life, he was sensible of the power of forgiving love. He rose from his knees, cleansed and happy. As for tobacco, it never bothered him again. How could it when his heart was overflowing with joy? Section, Preparing for a Revival. Barney was not the only young person in that community to experience the renewing grace of God. Others, too, had received the divine infilling. As always occurs when the Spirit of God is reviving His church, lay people, both men and women, old and young alike, were moved with burning zeal to win others to Christ. Among the people who felt the urge to proclaim the good news were the older brothers of F.G. Smith, 2 or 3 of the Warren boys, and several of their companions. In bands of 4 to 8, singers and workers, these young people began to hold meetings in adjoining neighborhoods, sometimes in schoolhouses, sometimes in churches, again in halls or in homes, wherever there was an opening. Prominent in this work, both in the singing and exhorting, was 16-year-old Barney Warren. For a year or more, these meetings went on before D.S. Warner himself came to Geneva Center Schoolhouse. Without doubt, every great revival has had outstanding leaders, but those leaders themselves rode upon a tide of conviction, contrition, and expectancy already flooding the coves and inlets of a multitude of seeking hearts. Who can doubt that Luther was able to accomplish what he did because there was already at work in Germany, and indeed all through Central and Northern Europe, the convicting and quickening Spirit of God? The evils in the church could not but trouble conscientious hearts everywhere. Certainly Luther was not alone in deploring her sins. The 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal by their weeping and prayers made possible the work of the Reformer. So was it in Wesley's day. England was at her depth in vice and degradation, both in church and society in general. Only the century before, Wesley had seen a Bunyan and a Fox, and silver-tongued Watts was an older contemporary. This is the hope of our own times, the revival for which we wait, the leader who will give it form and expression, who will under God bring it finally to the proportions of a tidal wave sweeping away the sins and shame of our land, waits upon the humble prayers and earnest self-giving of multitudes of God's little ones. The young people of Geneva Center were not really preachers. They were boys and girls about 15 to 18 and 20 years of age. They had not learned to preach, but God is not dependent upon the arrangement of our subject matter. He is dependent, humanly speaking, upon what we have in our hearts. If He makes glad within, then the best service that can be rendered is to go in that joy and tell it to others. They, therefore, that were scattered abroad upon the tribulation that arose about Stephen, traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to the Jews and to the Greeks also, and a great number that believed turned unto the Lord. These first-century evangelists were not all preachers. They were simply witnesses. They told what they knew, and it moved those who heard, as such witnessing always does. When D.S. Warner and his company came to Geneva Center, they found the ground well prepared. About 80 persons, mostly young people, had already been at the public altars, surrendering their hearts to God and putting away their sins. The community was like a plowed field ready for the sowing, and Warner knew how to sow. Slight of build and not above average height, both lungs affected by tuberculosis, when he entered the pulpit and began to speak, there was such undeniable truth in what he said, and such an authority in the way he said it, that there was no resisting him. His biographer gives us to understand that there were times when Warner was not quite sure of himself. Being an honest man himself, he believed in the honesty of others, especially of those whom he loved, and his humility of mind made it easy in some circumstances for him to suppose himself mistaken. But in the pulpit he knew. The impression of his preaching made was tremendous. Mr. Warren tells of a typical experience which occurred while the company were holding an evangelistic meeting in Canada. The place of meeting, a large upper room in a public hall, was crowded to capacity. The people sat spellbound. They leaned forward in their seats, never taking their eyes off the speaker's face. Warner's topic was, "The day of grace for Gentiles is soon past." At the end of the first hour, the congregation was still motionless. By half past the hour, some were clinging to their seats, trembling under conviction. At the end of another half hour, every person in the congregation was on his knees, seeking the mercy of God. Section Revival at Geneva Center. The schoolhouse at Geneva Center overflowed. It could not hold the crowds that came to hear the roaring of this lion of God against sin. Among those who came was Tom Warren, Barney's father. While not a professing Christian, Mr. Warren had been a student of the Bible all his life. His wife went to church. Tom Warren stayed home and read the Bible there, making up his own mind about its teachings and preparing for his next encounter with the minister or deacon. Nothing pleased him better than to point out the discrepancies between the standards of the Word of God and the lives and conduct of the church members. This practice was a favorite exercise of those who proclaimed themselves unbelievers in that day. It was also much easier for the church members to cry infidel than it was to mend their ways and conform to the demands of God's Word. So, Tom Warren was known as the infidel of the community. He was not an infidel, of course, far from it, but he was also far from knowing God. After Barney's conversion, his father opposed the meetings more than he had done before. It was as if the pressure of the Spirit brought to bear upon his heart increased his stubbornness. One day, when Barney was preparing to go to the meeting, all the rage so long pent up in his father's bosom broke loose, and the man said and did things which showed him, as all the preaching could not have done, how much he needed a great salvation. Torn between remorse and self-will, Tom Warren was soon listening to Warner's fiery denunciations of sin and persuasive offers of pardon. So intense was the conviction that seized upon this strong man that the seat shook with the trembling of his body. But he did not yield. The schoolhouse meeting closed, but another door was opened not far away. The elder Warren followed to that meeting, and now found himself brought to the point of surrender. As never before in his life, he saw what manner of man he was. He saw Christ dying on the cross, and he felt that it was all for him. He broke down and made partial surrender. But kneeling at that altar, he found one point at which he rebelled. He would not give his consent for Barney to leave home and go into the gospel work. The gospel team badly needed a bass singer, and young Barney had long felt the hand of God upon him for the work of evangelism. Not only could the young man exhort in a manner to bring men and women to their knees, but he was also endowed with a voice of extraordinary range and power, and his soul glowed with a passion for winning others to Christ. Warner had seen the ability and spirit of the lad, and had asked the elder Warren's permission to take Barney into the evangelistic work. The father would not give the permission, for he needed Barney to help in the work of the farm. But Warner could use authority when he was sure that God was directing. Hence, he now asked Warren point blank if he would let Barney go. God has the first claim, he pointed out, upon all his creatures. God had called Barney to go. The lad was unnatural to the work, and to hold him back was to fight against God. But Father Warren's will was strong. He said no, and meant it. But he reckoned without taking into account the strength of another will than his own. Arising from the altar, he started for the door. Halfway down the aisle, he collapsed and sank to the floor. When he tried to rise, he found himself unable to do so. For more than 2 hours the struggle raged. Warner would not give up. The point of conflict must be faced and decided, and it must be decided right. There never could be peace nor righteousness until that decision was made. A struggle like this discloses the sort of man Warner was. Conscientious himself, and more afraid of displeasing God than of death itself, he would not rest while another human soul whom he might influence to yield was unsurrendered. Clear was his conception of the fundamental place of the will in the soul's relationship to God, and sure he was that God could do and would do only what was right. What could be more reasonable than to ask a sinner to yield his will to his Maker and say humbly and sincerely, "Thy will be done"? Finally, the victory came. Tom Warren, man of iron determination, ceased his resistance. "Barney is the Lord's," he said, and rising from the floor with perfect ease, he called his family together and went out. Almost the entire Warren family were saved during these years. 4 of the boys became ministers, the youngest, George, being pastor for many years of a church in Battle Creek, Michigan. Tom Warren himself preaching in his home community for several years before the Lord called him to come up higher.